They thought she walked in empty-handed. Then the judge began listing assets, one by one. With every word, the courtroom realized just how wrong they had been. For 2 agonizing years, I, Evelyn Thorne, played the part they'd written for me. The discarded wife, the fatting memory of a corporate titan's past. My husband, Marcus Sterling, and his army of lawyers saw a woman broken by his very public affair, a woman who'd retreated into quiet grief while he flaunted his new life. They assumed my silence was surrender, my solitude, defeat. They believed every tear was a concession, and that by the time we reached this final hearing, I had been picked clean, a hollow shell with nothing left to claim. They were so confident. Marcus sat across the aisle, a smirk of inevitable victory playing on his lips. His lawyer had just finished a grandstanding speech about amicable settlements and moving forward. The judge adjusted her glasses, opened a new file, and began to speak. The court will now address the division of assets held solely or primarily in the name of Evelyn Thorne. The first asset she named wasn't our empty penthouse. It was a patent number, a quiet, revolutionary piece of software I developed in secret. Marcus's smirk froze. The second was a holding company in Luxembourg. His new fiancée gasped. The third was a controlling stake in the very startup he'd bragged about crushing. His lawyer's pen clattered to the floor. I simply sat, my hands folded, a faint, unreadable smile on my lips. The vengeance wasn't in screaming. It was in the inventory. He broke our vows, but I was never broken. I was just waiting. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you are watching from. The air in the courtroom was a thick, sterile soup of recycled air and suppressed glee. I, Evelyn Thorne, sat with my spine straight against the unforgiving wood of the plaintiff's table, my hands folded neatly on the cool surface. I could feel the collective gaze of the room like a physical pressure, a mixture of pity from the court clerk, curiosity from the board journalists, and the warm, radiant condescension flowing from the defense table. There, Marcus Sterling, my husband of 22 years, lounged with an enviable ease, his arm draped casually over the back of his fiancée, Celeste's chair. He looked like a man attending a mildly tedious shareholder meeting, confident of the quarterly results. Celeste, a vision of calculated glamour in a cream sheath dress, leaned into his touch, her diamond solitaire catching the fluorescent light with every subtle movement, a miniature lighthouse signaling his new allegiance. Her presence here, today of all days, was the final, brutal flourish in his performance of moving on. They thought I was broken. No, they knew I was broken. For 2 years, I had meticulously performed the role they'd assigned me, the discarded first wife, fatting into irrelevance like a forgotten photograph. I wore their narrative like the simple, navy blue shift dress I'd chosen for today, unadorned, somber, expected. Marcus's lead attorney, Robert Gage, had just concluded his remarks with a sonorous, almost paternal tone. "Your Honor," he'd said, spreading his hands wide, "my client simply wishes for an amicable and swift conclusion to this chapter. Mrs. Thorne has been apprised of all assets. We believe the proposed settlement is more than generous, given the circumstances." The circumstances. A deliciously vague term that encompassed my alleged emotional fragility, my lack of ongoing contribution to Sterling Technologies, and of course, Marcus's very public pursuit of new happiness. I kept my eyes on the grain of the wood before me, tracing a whorl that looked like a trapped galaxy. A sharper memory pierced the present. It was us, a decade ago, in a garage that smelled of solder and ambition. My fingers were flying over a keyboard, lines of elegant code blossoming on the monitor, the first heartbeat of what would become Sterling's flagship logistics algorithm. Marcus was on the phone, his voice a powerful, persuasive instrument, selling a vision we co-authored. "We're a team, Evie," he'd say, kissing my temple, smelling of coffee and late-night dreams. "Brain and brawn. You build it, I'll sell it." I believed him. I stepped back from the spotlight when the children came, trusting him to carry our shared torch. The first chill came at a company gala. I'd suggested a pivot into predictive analytics, sketching the concept on a napkin. He'd laughed, a warm, public sound, and patted my hand. "That's my wife, always the dreamer." The table laughed with him. The napkin, I later noticed, was used to soak up a ring of condensation from his drink. The cracking sounds became a deafening roar with a single headline. "Tech Titan's new muse. Sterling steps out with socialite Celeste Dubois." The photograph was artfully cruel. Marcus, his hand on the small of her back, laughing under the neon of a trendy club, a place he'd told me he was avoiding due to investor meetings. Then came the interview in the Chronicle. He spoke of evolving as individuals, of chapters reaching their natural end. He called me the bedrock of his past, a fond and fossilized thing. He said he'd ensure I was comfortable, the way one speaks of a pensioned-off family pet. That was the moment the grief, sharp and shattering, began to transmute. It hardened in my core, crystalline and purposeful. The tears I shed in my empty penthouse were real. For the lost years, the betrayed trust, the family shattered. But when I wept in front of the mediator Gage sent, those tears were strategic. I let them see a woman drowning in paperwork, overwhelmed by the labyrinth of our finances. I retreated. I let them win the skirmishes. The Napa Valley vineyard he wanted for entertaining, I sighed and relinquished it. The contemporary art collection he'd curated to impress, I claimed it gave me headaches. Each concession was a brick in the wall of their certainty. Marcus's lawyers, a pack of sleek wolves, grew bolder, their offers thinning like soup stretched too far. They stopped seeing me. They saw a liability to be settled. What they didn't see was the silent ledger. Not a physical book, but a digital fortress, encrypted and buried, where the true Evelyn Thorne was quietly, inexorably, reclaiming her future. While Marcus was winning and dining Celeste, I was in a soundproofed study I'd rented under an alias writing code. Project Phoenix. It was an elegant, devastatingly efficient patch, an upgrade to the very core of Sterling's logistics platform, fixing the memory leak flaw I'd identified years ago and he'd ignored. I filed the patent under an anonymous LLC named Janus Holdings, a ghost company from our earliest days he'd forgotten to dissolve. While he was buying Celeste a penthouse, I was on encrypted calls with Klaus Bauer, a razor-sharp Swiss lawyer I'd retained 5 years ago after I found the first discrepancy in a quarterly report. "Insurance, Klaus," I said then. He understood. Through a series of imperceptible movements, he channeled funds from stock I'd owned before marriage assets that were, by the original partnership agreement he'd never bothered to reread, irrevocably mine, into a new holding company in Luxembourg. The money began to breathe, to multiply in the shadows. And while Marcus was giving speeches about crushing the competition, I was looking at his greatest rival, Ethelgard Industries. He saw a failing company. I saw undervalued patents, a demoralized but brilliant engineering team, and a debt load he could have swallowed whole. Using a daisy chain of trusted former colleagues, people he'd fired or sidelined, people who still answered my calls, I began, penny by penny, share by share, to acquire its drowning debt and its equity. It was a Trojan horse built not of wood, but of his own arrogance and neglect. Now back in the tomb quiet of the courtroom, Robert Gage sat down, his performance complete. He shared a barely there smile with Marcus, a look that said almost over. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, shuffled her papers. I took a slow, deep breath, the air cold in my lungs. My lawyer, Alistair Reed, gave me a microscopic nod. She was a revelation, Alistair, a pillar of steel in a pinstriped suit. I'd contacted her a year ago, presenting my case and my silent ledger in a secure vault. She hadn't flinched. She'd smiled, a predator's smile, and said, "This will be exquisite." The judge looked up. "The court thanks counsel for their submissions. We will now proceed to the division of marital assets." She opened the familiar, thin file from Gage, then set it aside. She opened a second, considerably thicker binder, Alistair's binder. My heart, a frantic bird against my ribs, suddenly stilled. The hush deepened. "The court," she began, her voice clear and impartial, "will first address the assets held solely or primarily in the name of Evelyn Thorne, for the purposes of accurate valuation and division." I saw Marcus's eyebrow twitch, a faint ripple in his pond of calm. Held in her name, he was thinking of the empty bank accounts he'd left me, the dormant credit lines. Celeste adjusted her necklace, bored. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Asset 1, she recited. "United States Patent Number 11,876,429, titled Dynamic Resource Allocation and Flow Optimization Engine, held by Janus Holdings LLC, an entity wholly owned by Mrs. Thorne." The sound in the room changed. It was the sound of air being sucked in by 24 people at once. Marcus's head swiveled slowly toward me, the confusion in his eyes absolute. Robert Gage frowned, flipping violently through his own notes. Patent, Janus. The name meant nothing to him. It meant everything to me. It was the ghost from the garage, now fully materialized, holding the keys to his kingdom's most vulnerable gate. And the game, before he even knew he was playing, was already over. For a suspended second, there was only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the frantic, papery rustle from the defense table. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, feeling the heat of Marcus's stare like a laser on my profile. Confusion was too soft a word for what bloomed on his face. It was a tectonic shift, the bedrock of his certainty cracking open to reveal a void he didn't understand. The judge, unmoved, continued. "Asset 2, she intoned, her voice the steady drip of water shaping stone. "A majority interest in the private holding company, Valkyrie Capital, S.A., domiciled in Luxembourg. Mrs. Thorne is the sole beneficial owner." This time, a soft, involuntary gasp escaped Celeste. She knew Luxembourg. It was where one parked money one didn't wish to be seen. She turned to Marcus, her perfectly sculpted brows knitted. "What is that?" she hissed, the whisper carrying in the quiet. Marcus didn't answer. His hand, which had been resting so possessively on her chair, slowly retracted and clenched into a fist on the table. Robert Gage was now leaning over, whispering fiercely to his junior associate, who was scrolling desperately through a tablet, shaking his head. I allowed myself a single, slow blink. Valkyrie. A name chosen not for battle, but for choice. In myth, they were the ones who decided who would fall and who would rise. The funds within it were the seeds of my original stake, the 50% of our garage-born partnership that the young, lovesick Evelyn had been shrewd enough to legally ring-fence before our marriage merged everything. Marcus had considered that early paperwork a relic. I had considered it my foundation. "Asset 3, the judge went on, and the room leaned in, a single organism held by the thread of her words. "A controlling interest comprising 52% of voting shares in Ethilgard Industries, Incorporated." The dam broke. A sharp "objection" ripped from Robert Gage as he shoved back his chair and stood. "Your Honor, this is a complete shock, and we have no prior disclosure of these alleged assets. We must question their provenance, their very existence. This looks like concealment, if not outright fraud." Marcus was on his feet too, his face mottled with a furious crimson. "Ethilgard, that's impossible. That's a bankrupt." He caught himself, the businessman momentarily overriding the betrayed husband. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, locked onto mine. For the first time in years, he was truly seeing me. Not the grieving wife, not the silent partner, but the phantom in his boardroom, the ghost in his ledger. The judge's gavel cracked once, sharp as a bone breaking. "Sit down, Mr. Gage. Mr. Sterling, you will have your opportunity. These documents have been filed under seal with the court for the past 48 hours, pursuant to Procedural Rule 12.4, due to their sensitive commercial nature. Your office was served. Mrs. Thorne's counsel has been scrupulous." Her gaze swept over them, cool and dismissive. "Proceed, Ms. Reed." My lawyer, Alastair, stood. She was serenity in a pinstriped suit. "Thank you, Your Honor. Given the surprise evidenced by the defense and to expedite clarity for the court, I would like to call my client, Evelyn Thorne, to the stand." A fresh wave of murmurs crested and fell as I rose. The walk to the witness stand was the longest and shortest of my life. I passed Marcus's table. The air around him was hot, vibrating with a fury so potent it had a taste, metallic like blood. I did not look at him. I took the oath, my voice clear and steady in the hushed room. Alastair began, her questions a gentle but inexorable guide. "Mrs. Thorne, the patent referenced. Can you explain its nature?" I turned slightly to address the judge, but my words were for him. "It is a core software optimization for large-scale logistics platforms. It solves a chronic memory allocation and data flow issue that creates systemic lag." I paused, letting the technical jargon settle. "I identified this flaw in the Sterling Technologies platform approximately 7 years ago. I brought it to the company's attention at the time." "And what was the response?" "It was dismissed, deemed an unnecessary refinement." I could feel Marcus stiffen. He remembered. He'd called it polishing a finished diamond. Alastair led me through Valkyrie Capital. I explained its origin, my premarital assets, the Luxembourg structure chosen for privacy and sound regulation. "It was never concealed," I said calmly. It was separate. The original partnership agreement, filed with the state of California in 2003, clearly delineates my capital contribution as remaining my separate property unless explicitly commingled. It never was. But it was Ethelgard that was the masterstroke. Alistair displayed a timeline on a screen. Can you walk us through your acquisition of Ethelgard? I did. I spoke of watching the company, seeing past its surface struggles to its intellectual property vault and its demoralized, brilliant engineers, people Marcus had poached and then discarded. I spoke of using intermediaries, trusted former Sterling employees he had callously let go, to begin acquiring its distressed debt, then its equity, piece by piece over 18 months. It was a sound investment in undervalued potential, I said. The turnaround strategy is already being implemented. Then Alistair asked the question that hung in the air, thick as smoke. Mrs. Thorne, given the acrimonious nature of this divorce and your husband's control of Sterling Technologies, why would you invest in a direct competitor? This time I turned, I let my eyes meet Marcus. The room vanished. There was only the garage, the dreams, the betrayal, and this moment. It wasn't initially about competition, I said, and my voice was quieter, but it carried a lethal clarity. It was about preservation. I built Sterling's core. I understood its vulnerabilities. When it became clear my marriage was not only ending but being weaponized against me, I needed to ensure I had not just a settlement but a future. Ethelgard was that future. Its success is independent of Sterling. I paused, letting the next words land with the weight they deserved. However, given that my patent, 11,876,429, directly solves the primary scaling issue in Sterling's current platform, Sterling's future success is now, ironically, contingent on a licensing agreement with me. The chaos that followed was muted, internal. I saw the understanding slam into Marcus like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing a wife, he was losing control of his company's technological destiny. He was at the mercy of the dreamer he'd patted on the hand. But Alistair wasn't finished. Your Honor, she said, we submit one final document into evidence. Defense Exhibit 114B. It was a document from Marcus's own financial disclosures. This is a personal guarantee, signed by Mr. Sterling 18 months ago, securing a $50 million line of credit for Sterling Technologies against the future revenue projections of the current, unoptimized platform. She let that hang. The implication was a guillotine blade glittering in the courtroom light. His personal fortune, his very solvency, was pledged against a platform that was now technically obsolete. A platform only I could fix. Marcus made a choked sound. Robert Gage looked ill. Celeste stared at Marcus as if seeing a stranger, a man who wasn't a titan but a debtor. My examination ended. On the cross, Gage was flustered, aggressive, trying to paint me as deceitful, manipulative. You hid these assets. You led my client to believe you were destitute. I remained calm. I responded fully to every legal discovery request. The questions were never asked because the assumptions were already made. My husband assumed I had nothing of my own. That was his error, not my deception. The judge called for a recess. As I stepped down from the stand, my legs were steady. The silent ledger was now a public record. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted. Alistair handed me a glass of water, a small, satisfied curve to her lips. Across the aisle, Marcus was slumped in his chair, staring at the polished tabletop as if it were an abyss. His victory had been a mirage, and he was now stranded in the desert of his own making. The smirk was gone, erased. In its place was the hollow, stunned look of a man who has just realized he gambled everything on a lie, the lie that Evelyn Thorne had nothing left. As I gathered my things, I finally let my gaze meet his fully. I offered no smile of triumph, no glare of hatred. I simply looked at him, and then with a slow, deliberate blink, I turned away. The check had been presented. The payment was now due. The silence of the judge's retreating footsteps was instantly devoured by a rising tide of noise. It burst from the gallery, a cacophony of shocked exclamations, frantic typing, and the scuffle of reporters fighting to be the first out the door to file their story. Evelyn, Mrs. Thorne, over here. Flash guns popped, their light strobing against the paneled walls. I did not turn. Alistair was already at my elbow, a solid, immovable presence, and with a subtle nod, two broad-shouldered men in dark suits materialized, flanking us. Security from the Valkyrie payroll. They formed a corridor through the swirling chaos. Across the aisle, the scene was one of glorious, unraveling disarray. Marcus remained seated, his head in his hands, his shoulders hunched as if against a physical storm. Robert Gage was shouting into his phone, his face purpled with a mixture of rage and professional panic. And Celeste, her composure had shattered like cheap glass. She was on her feet, her beautiful face twisted into something ugly and desperate. "You said she was a non-entity." She hissed at Marcus's bowed head, her voice a sharp blade in the tumult. "You said this was a formality. What is all this? What does this mean for us?" She received no answer. The trophy wife was finally reading the fine print on the contract, and it was all liabilities. I allowed myself one last look at the tableau, the ruin of the man who thought he held all the cards, before I turned and walked away, the heavy courtroom door swinging shut behind us, muffling the sound of his crumbling world. The car that waited at the curb was not the modest sedan Marcus's investigators had noted in their reports. It was a silent, black vehicle, discreet but undeniably luxurious. The door closed with a sound like a vault ceiling. As it pulled away from the curb, the tension that had been my constant companion for 2 years, a tight wire running from my skull to my tailbone, began to hum, then vibrate, then snap. I let out a breath I felt I'd been holding for a lifetime. My hands, folded in my lap, trembled. It wasn't victory I felt, not the hot, bright kind. It was a profound, draining, and utterly peaceful relief. The performance was over. The architect could finally step out from behind the phantom. I went to my daughter, Sophia, at Stanford. I found her in a sun-dappled campus cafe, her brow furrowed with worry she'd carried for too long. She'd seen the headlines, heard the whispers that her mother was a broken woman. When I sat down and quietly explained, not the strategy, but the truth of my silence, the reason for my retreat, the relief in her eyes mirrored my own. The trust that had frayed at the edges began to knit itself back, stronger. "You were never just his wife, Mom," she said, squeezing my hand. "I always knew that. It was the only approval I needed." The settlement meetings that followed were held in Alistair's sleek top-floor conference room, with views of the city Marcus once believed he owned. The power dynamic was not just shifted, it was elegantly, ruthlessly reversed. I was no longer the supplicant. I was the counterparty. Marcus, now represented by a grim new lawyer who spoke in clipped, careful sentences, had lost his swagger. He looked older, deflated. We were not vindictive, we were surgical. I agreed to a clean 50-50 division of the remaining marital property, the penthouses, the remaining stock, the holdings that were genuinely tangled. But my assets, the patent, Valkyrie, Ethelgard, were placed firmly and irrevocably on my side of the ledger, non-negotiable. The discussion then turned to business. Alistair laid out the proposal. Sterling Technologies could license the Phoenix patent. It would save their platform, possibly their company. The terms were fair, but they were my terms, with royalties that would flow into Valkyrie for the next decade. The final meeting was not in a boardroom. Marcus requested it, and I agreed. We met in a neutral, anonymous lounge at a private airport. He sat across from me, a man stripped of his mythology. The expensive watch on his wrist seemed too heavy for him. "Why Evelyn?" he asked, his voice raspy. The anger was gone, burnt out, leaving only ashes of confusion. "All this secrecy, this war, why didn't you just fight me from the start?" I stirred my tea, the china clinking softly. "I was never at war with you, Marcus," I said and meant it. "You declared war on our partnership, on our vows. What you saw as a surrender was me disengaging from a battlefield you created, so I could build my own citadel. You mistook the construction for rubble." I met his eyes, seeing not the Titan, but the man from the garage who had gotten lost in his own reflection. "You thought the only asset of value was what you could see, what you could control. You forgot that the most valuable thing I ever brought to you was my mind. And you," I finished softly, setting my cup down, "you voluntarily wrote it off." I stood to leave. He didn't call after me. There was nothing left to say. Weeks later, I walked into the headquarters of Ethelgard Industries. The lobby was being refurbished, the old, defeated signage replaced with a new, sleek logo. I didn't go to the CEO's office. I went straight to the engineering floor. A young team, their faces alive with an energy I remembered from the garage, was gathered around a screen. They fell silent as I approached. "Don't stop on my account," I said, offering a real smile. "Show me where the friction is." For a moment, they hesitated. Then one of them, a woman with sharp eyes and code etched into her soul like I once had, pointed to a line on the screen. "Right here, the throughput bottlenecks." I leaned in, my mind already engaging with the problem, the elegant dance of logic and solution. This was not his legacy. This was mine, built not from spite but from self-preservation, crafted not in his shadow but in the quiet light of my own intellect. The silent ledger was closed. A new one, full of light and open collaboration, was just beginning. I had not just won a settlement. I had reclaimed my narrative, and in these bright, humming rooms, I was finally writing the next chapter with my own hand.